As far as strange occurrences go out on these sprawling, isolated Yellowstone trails, it's come to be somewhat expected. But this one really sticks with me. You see, I'm a ranger and I've spent the last decade getting more acquainted with every root, tree, and geyser in Yellowstone than I am with my own mother. As for strange occurrences, I must say both summon the same bewildered amusement within me. My job requires me to remain very vigilant, and sometimes that means going above and beyond the call of duty just to ensure the safety of the park visitors. I mean, half the calls I respond to are rescue calls. The other half are missing persons cases. And no, it never gets easier hearing a person's voice lump with despair on the other end of the line, pleading for help in finding their lost family member or friend. The bizarre case that gnaws at me, the one that hovers in the background of my thoughts, waiting for the opportune moment to reemerge in a vivid gossamer flash, happened on one sunny summer day. A man, whom we'll call Jim, had ventured out on a solo hike just a few hundred meters away from the Norris Geyser Basin. With the abundant geothermal features, Yellowstone becomes a hub of colorful, otherworldly activity. But more often than not, that's where danger lurks. Now, a couple of hours later, I received a phone call. Jim's wife, with a crackling voice of despair, informed me that her husband had gone hiking on this favorite trail of his, but an overdue return had alarmed her. Jim had a heart condition, and she feared the worst. She begged me to help her find him. Just as I'm sure my team knew the first time they'd witnessed the notoriously ephemeral Grand Prismatic Spring, they knew their job was all about diving into the unknown. And with 25 years of combined experience, we knew we'd seen more than our fair share of unusual happenings. But this one takes the cake. Jim was last reported to be on a well-trodden trail, so it should have been straightforward to find his faint tracks left behind on the gravel. It wasn't long before my team set out like wild wolves, sniffing through the air, scouring the ground with an unwavering sense of duty. And just when we thought we'd hit a dead end, one of our vets had found something. It was an article of clothing, a blue plaid shirt. The same shirt Jim was supposedly wearing according to his anxious wife. It was wrapped around the bough of a tall, ghostly pale tree reaching towards the sky. 45 feet up, like it was grasping for help, the shirt dangled, worn by the wind and the sun. My guys stared upwards, mouth agape, standing in a tight cluster at the tree's knobby base. None of us could wrap our heads around how a shirt could end up there. The idea that Jim had flung it overhead in one incredible throw was the most plausible explanation we could muster, and even that remained far-fetched. Now the sun was setting, and that's when the cold, unpleasant sensation of being watched truly crept in. We temporarily lost our sense of duty, of course captivating by Jim's floating shirt. Within moments, helicopters were redirected, accompanied by the blaring sounds of sirens from other rescue teams. But we never found Jim. His scent could not be tracked, his footprints could not be traced, and no other sign of him nor his so-called heart condition could be found. His wife's voice on the phone still rings shrill and foreboding in my ears as I rummage through my thoughts trying to get a solid grip on what happened. Now there's a handful of people we had talked to, but there was one other hiker who had claimed to have seen Jim walking further down the trail. Now the strange witness, who went by the name of Tom, a lanky guy with a stringy beard and eyes that never quite settled, couldn't offer much aside from sending us deeper into the wild. He spoke of walking alongside Jim for a mile or so, mentioning that the man was quite the chatterbox. Tom explained that Jim seemed excited, and he would tell Tom about the secret spot he discovered on a previous hike, a spot that Jim claimed was a special place where you could see the earth breathe, a spot where the geothermal activities had inspired him deeply. Now, of course, this would catch our attention, another lead to guide our mind-boggle team. Now, Tom went on to explain that he'd taken a break and caught his breath, but Jim had been determined to keep going. He wished Jim well as the distance slowly swallowed Jim's form. We retrieved Jim's phone number from his wife and decided to give Tom a call. Despite being a preoccupied man, he greeted us kindly, taking a moment to remember who we were. "Ah, yes, the park ranger. How are you? Any developments?" Tom's voice shook with eagerness. We explained the situation and described the strange sighting of Jim's shirt caught in the tree. There was a noticeable pause on the other end of the line before Tom spoke up. "Odd," he murmured. "Jim seemed quite attached to that shirt. Said it was his lucky hiking shirt." Another stroke of perplexity fell upon us. Why would a man remove his lucky shirt during a hike through Yellowstone? Was it a fluke or something more sinister? Spurred on by this new information, we expanded our search further into the area where Tom had last seen Jim. I had heard my share of strange happenings here in Yellowstone, but rarely did they leave such a string of enigmatic clues. The more we searched, the colder Jim's trail got. Meanwhile, the eerie feeling of being watched persisted, as if the trees themselves had eyes. A sense of unease began to envelop our team in a chilling embrace. My crew and I, hardened rangers, found ourselves glancing back over our shoulders more frequently, paranoia clawing at the edges of our consciousness. Hours turned into days, and a stone grew heavier in our hearts. We thought to give up. The case consumed us, and our dreams were plagued with speculations at every turn. However, even now, we have yet to find a trace of Jim aside from that blue-plaid shirt. Even in Yellowstone, with all its beauty, there is still the ebb and flow of nature, where things go awry at any given second around any given turn. Ever since that fateful day, back in '99, my life had taken a very uncanny turn. You see, I was a ranger at Yellowstone National Park. It was a job that I truly cherished. It was during a search and rescue op that one would change my outlook on the wilderness forever. Now, I can't say the name of the person we were looking for to protect their privacy, but let's call him John. It was the end of July, and the summer was in full swing. Yellowstone was teeming with visitors, all eager to witness the wild beauty the park has to offer. That also meant more chances for unprepared hikers to wander off the beaten path, as had happened with John. When we got the call that he'd gone missing, a chill crept down my entire body. I'd seen too many people vanish into the wilderness, never to be found again. And so the search began, early the following morning, just as the sun began to creep over the horizon. We had split off into groups, combing the vast landscape for any signs of the lost hiker. My team had been assigned the area near a dense portion of forest, close to a stream that flowed into the park's river system. A popular route for the inexperienced, many had gone off course here before. As we trudged through the underbrush, I couldn't shake an eerie feeling. None of those other search and rescue ops had left me feeling quite like this. My gut was telling me that something was off, that this wasn't a regular case of a hiker simply losing their way. Hours went by, and we found no sign of John. Well, the sun began to set, casting its shadows across the land. The last hours of daylight were fading, and it was now unsafe for us to continue. So we regrouped back at the ranger station, and I could not help but overhear the worried whispers of my fellow rangers. They said they'd seen something that didn't walk like an animal, but more like a human. Now, of course, these reports were dismissed quickly by the others. The stress, the pressure to find John, and the wild imagination of my friends are playing tricks on them. I tried to quiet my unease. We resumed the search the following day, this time bringing along trained search dogs to help us in our efforts. As the dogs sniffed their way through the densely wooded area, I continued to feel that same sense of unease. It just wouldn't shake. It was then the dogs began acting strangely. They seemed spooked, their tails pinned between their legs, whining and refusing to move forward. Instead of leading us towards any signs of John, they would pull back, urging their handlers to retreat. Time was running out, and still there was no trace of the missing hiker. I held on to that hope that maybe he'd stumbled upon one of the park's shelters and was just waiting for someone to find him. We had to do a final sweep of the area, but when the team split up this time, I found myself all alone. That's when I saw it. There, in the shadow of one of the towering trees, was a figure. At first, I thought it was another searcher, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized this was something else entirely, for it stood on two legs, shrouded by the gloom of the forest, seemingly immune to the sunlight poking through the canopy. My entire being froze up. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was having a heart attack. It was tall, like nothing I'd ever seen, but it was staring right back at me, its eyes piercing through my being with an intensity I cannot describe. The air around me seemed to chill, and I just knew that there was something otherworldly about what was happening. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the dense undergrowth, fading into the darkness. I was left standing there, my heart pounding, utterly stunned by what I'd witnessed. Now, when I caught my breath, I rushed back to the search party and tried my best to explain what I'd seen. But hardly anyone believed me. I couldn't blame them. It was beyond anything any of us had ever experienced. Confusion and fear gripped hold of me, but I couldn't shake the fact that maybe this thing had something to do with John's disappearance. By the way, we never found John. He was added to the ever-growing list of hikers lost in Yellowstone. But I could not forget what I'd seen that day. And ever since then, I've become obsessed with understanding the paranormal. In fact, not too long after, I quit my job as a ranger and dedicated my life to the study of the supernatural, including what I'm convinced was a Bigfoot sighting. Of course, if I mention this to law enforcement friends, they consider me a crackpot, a madman chasing an elusive legend. But I can't refute my experience. It'll always make me wonder if there's more to this universe than what we think. After all, I really want to know what happened to John. I spent the first 10 years of my life in Yellowstone. For you see, my father was a park ranger, and we lived in one of those cabins that were usually reserved for the rangers and their families. Now, as a kid, I loved the woods. The animals, the waterfalls, the geysers, the sights, the trails. I remember how the ground always seemed to tremble under my feet, like the park itself had a heartbeat, and that heart was continuously beating. Now, as I grew older, I followed my old man's footsteps and became a ranger myself, working first for the National Park Service before joining the agency's search and rescue team. Yellowstone had become both my home and my workplace. But my life changed after a series of strange occurrences with some campers and hikers that took place in a matter of a few weeks. It was the most intense and inexplicable summer I've ever experienced. Now, the first incident took place in the northeastern section of the park, near Lamar Valley. A small group of campers reported something horrifying and unnatural. These horrific screams disturbing the quiet of the night, turning their once peaceful time amongst the wild into a nightmare. Now, when I visited the campground, questioning the campers and the eyewitnesses, I guess you could call them, they all seemed genuinely scared, more worrying that they turned down the offer to be escorted back to their campsites by me and my colleagues. Sensing their distress, I let them camp closer to our cabin, which would ease their minds. Now, weeks later, a lone hiker had actually returned to a visitor center, pale as a sheet. and they reported what this individual claimed as an enormous man-like ape creature stalking him. Now, it's since then that I began to recognize a pattern. Incidents usually began with unusual screams, startling even the most seasoned campers and hikers. Animals around would begin behaving strangely, as there would be signs of unseen menaces lurking amongst the trees. Stories of the Yellowstone beast began to spread, and soon we found ourselves struggling to continue our daily duties without being interrupted by nervous, terrified hikers. Despite their fears, no one had ever been hurt by this supposed being, at least to our knowledge. So I started thinking that perhaps it was just a clever prank, perpetrated by some locals or a tourist with no other goals than to terrify people and make the rangers recategorize their priorities. But that would all change. I'd been out alone, exploring one of the park's most expansive trail networks, when I lost track of time, and night suddenly fell. I knew I was some distance away from my cabin, and with how dark it was, I needed to pick up my pace. As I moved along, the familiar sounds of the forest, which had once become a soundtrack to my adventures, suddenly turned more ominous and menacing. I heard these blood-curdling screams in the background, coupled with some strange, deep grunting noises, all narrated by my colleagues and the park's visitors in the incidents that I had documented. But as I pushed forward, trying to pick up my pace even more, I realized that these horrendous noises were coming from different directions, kind of ping-ponging off each other, as if there were multiple of these things echoing all around me. And so in my nervousness, I felt like there were eyes on me, watching me from the tree line and just waiting for the opportune moment to grab me. Now suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble, causing me to lose my balance, tumbling to the ground. More than just another innocuous tremor. This one felt like a malicious entity asserting its presence, daring me to question its existence. I nearly collapsed. I was so scared. That's when the screams and grunting came even closer. For the first time in my years serving the visitors, I felt a primal fear that rooted itself deep into my bones. I fought the overwhelming urge to panic, doing my best to calm myself and keep moving. Somehow, I was able to find my way back to my cabin, bolting the door, practically collapsing onto the floor. Now, since then, the Yellowstone beast, as a few of us have dubbed it, has faded from my memory slowly, but not much. Afterwards, I left the park in search of a more mundane life, but those memories will never leave altogether. I try and remain somewhat involved with the park, of course a little more indirectly than directly, and continue to stay updated on strange things. Maybe it's my history with the park or my desire to find some form of closure after so many strange experiences. But every time there's word of another encounter, I can't help but take notice. I'm not sure if you'll ever fully understand, unless you fully lived it yourself. Anybody out there listening to this who has had their own strange experience or encounter, they would understand. It was the end of October, and the air was slowly giving way to the biting cold of winter. I had recently begun my job as a ranger at Yellowstone, determined to make a difference. I just closed the visitor center for the night, and it was around 9 p.m. I was walking along the path that led back to the ranger station, just engrossed in my thoughts, when something peculiar caught my attention. The haunting hoots of an owl echoed through the woods around me, but there was something off about the sound. It was almost as if the owl's call was laced with the shrill cry of an infant. I didn't give it much thought at first, brushing it off as my overactive imagination just simply getting the better of me. However, when I heard it again, closer this time, I stopped and I listened more intently. The strange hoots continued sporadically, but it seemed to be coming from all around me. as if multiple of these were calling out in unison. I tried to shake the unease creeping up on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching my every move. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of the station, and just as I rounded a corner, I saw it, several feet ahead of me. Something perched on a low-hanging branch. It was the most unnerving thing I'd ever seen. It appeared to be an owl, but I couldn't reckon it anything close to ordinary. Standing at least 4 feet tall, it had deep red eyes that seemed to incandesce in the moonlight. Its wings were massive, spanning at least twice the length of its body, and its feathers were a mix of the darkest black and the midnight blue. I froze in my tracks, too terrified to move as I locked eyes with the beast. The cacophony of sounds suddenly ceased, and the forest was enveloped in an eerie silence. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my chest. Now, despite my fear, I couldn't look away from those piercing red orbs. It was though they were trying to bore into my very soul. And then it spoke. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, or that perhaps the creature had made some mimicry of human speech. But the longer I stood my ground, the more convinced I became that it was genuinely speaking to me. "What are you doing here?" it asked, the voice like a rasp of a death rattle. I searched for my own voice, but it seemed to have abandoned me in that moment. After a long silence, I managed to stammer a single word. "Work." This entity surveyed me, its eyes narrowing into slits as it considered my answer. Then it asked if I posed a threat to it. I told it no, and that I'm here to protect the park. It tilted its head as it found the idea amusing. It asked me if I thought I protect the land more than it does. The entity was speaking to me telepathically, informing me that they are the ones that guard the earth. It watched me for a moment longer before it slowly spread its wings. I know this story isn't much, but it's a bizarre one, and I really don't know how to account or how to explain what I experienced. It's not really something I can go and tell my fellow rangers just due to the nature of it, so I thought I would share it here with all of you. What do you guys think? Was this a supernatural entity, or was this something that was physical? I reckon it was about 10 years ago when I hung up my ranger hat and headed out to Yellowstone. I'd been on search and rescue before, but this would become my first solo venture into the great outdoors post-retirement. I understand it sounds strange to most, but for me, the strange beauty of Yellowstone was the perfect place for an old soul like me to rest his weary head. As I settled into my solitary existence, I began to hear whispers of strange going-ons in the nearby woods. My gut told me not to take those murmurs lightly, seeing as how those woods had a long history of uncanny occurrences. People talked a lot about supernatural connections to the land itself. That much I was never exactly sure on, but I guess with what I'm about to tell you, it would make sense. It wasn't long before I found myself exploring right near the swamps near my cabin, driven by a deep-seated desire to understand this supernatural phenomenon even more. As I explored, I couldn't ignore the unmistakable sense of someone watching me. The more I ventured out there by myself, I felt like I was being stalked. But of course, I'm an old guy with plenty of experience. Maybe I'm not all there in my head. Or maybe my intuition is right. I figured that putting a little distance between me and what I thought was someone following me would do me good. One evening, during a lonesome trek through a dense undergrowth of trees, I stumbled upon something I couldn't believe. I saw, standing on all fours, a being both magnificent and terrifying in its size and stature. It was shaggy, gray-white, and almost seamlessly blended into the fog that surrounded it. Even its eyes were pools of darkness that set high upon its head. I studied it with shaking breaths. This thing, the likes of which I'd never seen in all my years as a ranger, began moving in my direction. What had I come face to face with? Something entirely undiscovered, perhaps, or something more ancient and elusive? Well, as this thing continued its approach, the air seemed to thicken with a sulfurous odor that weighed heavy in my lungs. That's when I noticed this entity almost seemed transparent. My instincts cried out for me to flee, but yet I felt rooted and paralyzed. I was unable to tear my eyes away from this. Taking a step back, I decided that perhaps it was time to break the silence. I began praying verbally, out loud, and instantly, this thing stopped, looked at me with a sense of intelligence, a curiosity that mirrored my own, reflected in its own obsidian stare. The standoff continued, and a wave of realization washed over me. This was a demonic entity of some kind. It just reeked of evil. This thing came within about 20 feet of me before it completely dematerialized right in front of me in this thick, soupy mist and then evaporated. Look, you can choose to believe me or not. I'm just relaying what I experienced. Now, from what I understood, and I say this from the feelings I got, is that this was some sort of ancient Native American entity or guardian. But again, it was evil. There was nothing benevolent about it. It just radiated hatred, even though it was white and had black eyes. Although, looking back, I don't quite understand if there's any correlation between its physical appearance and what its intentions were. To make a long story short, let's just say I didn't stick around too much longer. And within the week, I was already back at home, enjoying life closer to the city, and realizing that maybe my time of being out in the woods is long since past. Maybe that's just a part of my life I have to learn to get over. But I'm curious to know your thoughts.